Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to this Ernest Becker Foundation webinar on death, anxiety, and discrimination with Doctors Allissa Richardson and Sheldon Solomon. My name is Lila Rothschild. I direct all the programs for EBF, and I'll briefly tell you about EBF and then we'll get started. So the EBF was founded in 1993 to continue the work and application of Ernest Becker. And that is to examine the ways in which the human awareness of our own mortality affects our beliefs and behaviors on both an individual and societal level. So we look at how culture shields us from death anxiety by enabling us to feel that we're part of something important and valuable that will live on after we're gone. And this manifests in a number of very interesting and sometimes contradictory ways. So from Becker's work, the field of terror management theory was developed to empirically study the ways in which the awareness of our mortality impacts human behavior. In particular, when reminded of mortality, we cling to our cultural worldviews. And to learn more about Becker or TMT, you can visit us at ernestbecker.org. So there's been extensive TMT research relating to discrimination, with the finding that most of us, when reminded of our mortality, are more likely to discriminate against those who are different from ourselves. And so today we will explore how our existential anxiety manifests in the context of issues of discrimination and racial justice. So today we're honored to have with us Dr. Alyssa Richardson, Assistant Professor of Journalism at USC Annenberg. She's the author of Bearing Witness While Black, African Americans, Smartphones, and the New Protest Journalism. We also have someone familiar to many of you, Dr. Sheldon Solomon, Professor of Psychology at Skidmore College and co-founder of Terror Management Theory. Welcome to you both. Just a reminder to everyone, when we open the Q&A, you can use the live chat feature to the right of the YouTube player. And I think I'll hand it over to Sheldon to begin.
Well, thank you, Lila, and thanks everybody for joining us today. It is delightful for me to have the opportunity to talk with Dr. Richardson about her wonderful book and her ideas. It's a beautiful book. And before I stumbled onto any mention of our work, I found it just really compelling, poignantly profound, beautiful prose, and framing ideas that are very familiar to people in the Becker Foundation in a very new way that I think extends the range of applicability and frames it in ways that make it just very immediate, at least for me, and I hope for you also. And so thank you for being here, Professor Richardson. And let's just start, if you would, by giving us a classic comic book overview of the book and how you see it connected to the existential anxieties that our work is concerned about.
Absolutely. And I want to start by thanking you, Dr. Solomon, for having this event and hosting this. And your theories have been so formative as I began to study why African Americans were engaging in advocacy journalism at such high rates. And so I have just a quick overview that I want to share with you all. I'm a very visual person, so I have a few little slides. And I'm wearing two hats today. So I am also coming to you not only from USC's Annenberg School for Common Journalism, but this entire year I'm also a fellow at Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center, where I've really been studying and digging into this phenomenon of African Americans feeling like they have to archive or save their journalism that in ways that will outlive them. And so this year, my project at HSC has really been focused on making sure that I can develop all these innovative ways of archiving and saving that go beyond legacy media so that this work doesn't die with them. And so I'll give this the title, A Brief History of Black Witnessing in the US. And these are some notes that I've gleaned from Bearing Witness While Black, and also this year kind of studying the best ways to ethically save what we see on the news, or not on the news, on social media. And so I'll just anchor this with how it all began. 10 years ago, I started the first Mojo Lab at a historically Black college called Morgan State University. And that was really born out of TMT. My students wanted to report, they wanted to do journalism, but our school was located in a very dangerous place. And anybody who has seen The Wire knows that Baltimore is a very disinvested city, but it's not a city that doesn't have people who care and love it very much. And so my students said, how can we get out and do journalism with these big bulky cameras without drawing attention to ourselves? Because we'd even had a student who experienced a home invasion when someone saw her with this big expensive equipment going in and out of her apartment. And so when this iPhone came out with this front and rear facing camera, I thought, why don't we try to do this? Why don't we see if we can do stand-ups and make news out of this? And that's really what brought us all around the world. We taught in Africa and South Africa and Morocco, but it was back home that I began to see the impact of the cell phone in a totally different way. While we were kind of experimenting playfully in a lab, 4 years later, we're looking at this scene that many of you may remember from Ferguson. And I learned about Ferguson. I learned about Mike Brown's death, not from legacy media, not from my colleagues in journalism, but from citizen journalists who were live tweeting all day long. Oh my God, they shot someone in front of my apartment. They left his body there. And 4 hours later, he's still there. And that's a detail got lost in a lot of the mainstream coverage, that the protests actually began when moms were protesting and saying, why can't his mom cross that tape and get to him, the police tape? Why is he laying out here in the August heat uncovered? And so as this militarized response begins to ramp up and you see peaceful protesters being attacked, I was learning of all of that on Twitter. And the Mojo Lab that I started just a few years before really had to change, really had to shift. And a lot of the work that I was doing with my students then centered upon how do we make sure that the correct narratives are getting out there and not just the most sensationalized ones. And so at that same time, I should say, this is the first year also, first semester, first week that I've decided to go to grad school. And so my first week in my PhD program is when I'm seeing all of this. And all of this is really informing the way that I'm looking at mobile journalism now as a way of self-preservation, as a way of countering popular narratives, and not just as a way anymore of making sure that my students are safe in their Baltimore community. And all of this made me think back even farther to when I was 9 years old watching this video with my dad. And I never thought I'd even live in Los Angeles after seeing the Rodney King beatings. And my dad is a son of the Caribbean. And I remember him saying, oh my God, they don't do this to people back home. And I thought, back home, yeah, this is home for me. You know, the US is. So is this going to happen to you here? Is it going to happen to my brother? And my brother, who's 3 years, just almost 3 years younger than me, was in first grade or so. And he was just looking in awe. And my dad made us watch it. And he said, I want you to be aware that there's a special way you'll have to interact with police when you get older. And as a child of the 80s who's growing up in this just say no era, we've got DARE in our schools. We've got cops coming in our school who are friendly, who are bringing us pizza and giving us badges. It was total cognitive dissonance. And I thought, well, how come there's Officer Blue who's in my school who seems very kind and this is happening? And I didn't see this in the literature when I began to really study the impact of cell phones and video coverage of police brutality. I didn't see this much anywhere. And I thought this is a real watershed moment because this is the first time someone picked up their camera and filmed police and we had ocular proof of what was going on. And so for me, being a grad student, being out in the world and knowing that I'm teaching my kids mobile journalism, but not seeing mobile journalism being traced at all in this way as a tool of cop watching really disturbed me. And so that's where this book, Bearing Witness While Black, came from, African Americans, Smartphones, and the New Protest Journalism. It's really born of me having 10 years in the field of mobile journalism and me initially wanting to have fun with my students and wanting them to have this barrier of entry lowered so that they could get into journalism and feel confident and comfortable. But then that morphing to me going abroad with my students to South Africa and Morocco and really studying with them what does mobile journalism look like on another continent as we're watching the Arab Spring unfold and we're watching all of the protests erupt in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya. And I began to see it again when I come back home to Occupy Wall Street, how cell phones were just an outsized part of that movement, to then Ferguson. And I thought, well, let me trace it back even farther than that, because this is bigger than me. It's bigger than my experience in the lab with my students. And I decided to go as far back as American history takes us, right? And I looked for who've been Black witnesses before, as I call them in the book. And Black witnesses do the really heavy lifting of connecting these dots, so to speak. And so when I found this visual, it really helped me connect a lot of dots. Frederick Douglass was one of the first Black witnesses who tried to show us in not one, not two, but 3 autobiographies what slavery was like. And he bore witness in the technology of his time. You had pamphlets, you had autobiographies, and you had newspapers. And so that's what he was using to really let people know that millions of souls were being lost in the transatlantic slave trade. And he went on this one-man kind of international tour, letting people know what was going on. And as I see these dots just kind of escalate, and I see all of these people, going to points west, I looked at first how it was just a few countries, and then how it was just the coast, and then how they had to go deeper and deeper into the continent to get more and more people, and how the lion's share of these people ended up in Brazil, but some ended up in my ancestral homes in the Caribbean, as well as the East Coast and the southern regions of the US. And I think about his witnessing, and I think about what he was trying to tell us about not only life as a slave, but death. I think of a lot of the talks that I heard surrounding my studies when I was researching this book. And Dr. Solomon, I mean, one of the most chilling things that I heard was, if you were to dry up the Atlantic Ocean, there will be a trail of bones that you could trace to all of these points west that these dots are following. And I thought about this in terms of a real Holocaust that we don't frame as such. And I wanted to do that in the book because that is really the heart of what Black witnesses are hinging their work upon every time they pick up a mobile camera. And they're continuing the work of people who came after Frederick Douglass. Ida B. Wells was awarded a Pulitzer Prize posthumously last year for her tally, her impeccable tally of lynchings during her lifetime. She was able to track from points north. She would sneak down into the south, gather all her news and go back up and print it in newspapers, because her own newspaper in Memphis was bombed when she reported on a heinous lynching of her friends. And she tracked 4,000 of these throughout her lifetime. And this picture, I've cropped out the most incendiary parts, but it inspired, the song, well, the poem first, but the song Strange Fruit that Billie Holiday sang. And I think about all of the witnessing that Ida B. Wells was doing. And I think about the bravery that it took her to go down to track these things and make sure that they weren't lost to history. And again, she's doing that with the knowledge that if she doesn't name these people, then they die twice. I think about John Lewis. I think about, we lost him last year on the same day that we lost C.T. Vivian, who was also a great civil rights icon. And John Lewis knew how to have his demonstrators stage photographs like this. You have to remember that during the 1960s, the news only lasted 15 minutes. That's where the phrase 15 minutes of fame comes from. And so this 24-hour news cycle didn't exist, and you really had to do something that caught the eye of producers. And so John Lewis and members of SNCC and CORE and NAACP and other organizations knew very well that they had to stage these moments of near death, again, to hinge on the existential, to let people know that this is an urgent issue of civil rights and that this needs to happen. And these images really swayed the North to get involved because they didn't know, they hadn't seen with their own eyes Southern style racism. And so in this book, I interview a new vanguard who is doing this work, who are following, as they said in their own words, in the footsteps of Frederick Douglass, of Ida B. Wells, of John Lewis, to use their cell phones now to cover police brutality. And they expressed to me something so profound. They said, there have really been 3 overlapping eras of domestic terror in the United States: slavery, which gave way to lynching, which gave way to what we have now, police brutality. And those eras of domestic terror have largely affected African Americans. And African Americans, though, through each of those eras, have used the technology of their time to bear witness while Black, whether it was pamphlets and slave narratives, to newspapers, to radio, to television, to now smartphones. We really tried to use everything that we could to let people know what was going on. And so I've interviewed Alicia Garza, who's the foundress of the Black Lives Matter movement. Really interesting people like the family attorney for Alton Sterling and Walter Scott, and now George Floyd. Chris Stewart is their attorney. Devin Allen, who's the person who's on the very front of this presentation, whose photographs ended up on the cover of Time magazine. He's featured there. He also did the art, the cover of the book. And I have, rappers in here, rappers turned intellectuals, activists, scholars, all kinds of folks who really decided to do this work full time. And Devin, as I mentioned, is one of the most prolific of the mojos, the mobile journalists. He is one who has reached international acclaim now. He started out as an Instagram photographer, just shooting pictures of his friends and weddings and beautiful girls, as he calls them, in Baltimore. And on the day that the Freddie Gray uprisings occurred, he took both his cell phone and a DSLR and went out and just began shooting. And he landed on the cover of Time magazine, which made him only one of 3 amateurs who's ever done so in the history of the magazine. It's almost 100-year-old magazine. And the fact that he did this twice, this is from last summer, where he did a photographic shoot of the peaceful die-ins that were staged around the time of the George Floyd uprisings. This made history. And he's now a Gordon Parks Fellow, one of the very first Gordon Parks Fellows. And so as I close, I also just mentioned in the book how I'm a Black witness myself. I mentioned having seen a lot of these things growing up in terms of police brutality in the form of Rodney King and his beating and what that meant to LA and what that meant as a formative moment for me, understanding that there were many different kinds of cops. Encountering police brutality myself, I highlight in the book how it looks different for women and what that fear is like. And then I've also, for the first time this year, put out my own documentary where we went around the nation. I worked with a group called GRX Immersive Labs, and we use virtual reality to really immerse people in what protest looks like across the nation. And we went to Atlanta, Los Angeles, Washington, DC, and Minneapolis, of course. And we talked to dozens of people about what their stand looked like. And everybody's protest was different. Some people cooked, some people danced, some people made clothes. People like the Compton Cowboys did voter registration. And so all of these different kinds of protest now form, all of the reporting that I do about this work. And I was really pleased last summer that even though it was one of the most tragic videos that has ever crossed my desk and one of the most tragic videos I've ever had to look at, I was happy that there has finally been an understanding of these 3 overlapping eras of domestic terror against Black people. And that we're finally, I think, at a point nationally where we're ready to discuss how that affects how all of us live and how all of us have existential dread about certain issues. And this New Yorker cover, which was painted by the great Kadir Nelson, really brought me to tears because it does in one painting what I was trying to do in 300 pages of book, right? It shows you these overlapping eras. At the bottom, you have this diagram of what slaves would have looked like in the bows of the ships that brought them over, those dots I was showing you that were flying by. You also see at the bottom right corner, Whipped Pete, and he's the first slave who sat for a journalist and allowed his scarring to be photographed. You also have in the very center of this, you have the Rodney King video, and just above that, Emmett Till. You have the I Am a Man placards from Dr. Martin Luther King's very last stand with Memphis sanitation workers. And Medgar Evers is there, Dr. King is there, Malcolm X is there. And then on the left-hand side, in the left, or what you would say George's right lung, would be a man was lynched yesterday. And that's NAACP's iconic flag that flew outside the office for dozens of years. And then you have Alton Sterling and Freddie Gray is here, Eric Garner's here, Tamir is here, Trayvon is here, and Sandra Bland is here. And what's so sad about this photograph is that there's so many other people that could not fit, even though George had a mighty frame. And so as I looked at the events of last summer, and I looked at the almost triumphant kind of way that African Americans still bore witness and still picked up those cell phones and still recorded and documented, I was still asking why. And they told me, because we're trying to connect these dots. Black witnessing is about connecting these three overlapping eras and doing something that we couldn't do in the previous eras. And what they communicated to me was, during slavery, we couldn't look in real time, lest you incur the wrath of your master as well. You will get beaten too. You could not look during the era of lynching. In lynching photographs, there are no Black people who are crouched down at the bottom, kind of peeking and trying to see what is going on. They're fleeing town. And now with cell phones, however, this is the first time that we're able to bear witness to someone's final moments in real time. And that takes incredible bravery to put one's body in harm's way, to say, I'm not going to leave you alone in these final moments. I'm going to stay here with you. I'm going to make sure people remember your name and know what happened to you. And I'll make sure people know the aggressor's name. Because for too long, when people documented lynchings in white or mainstream newspapers, it said these persons died at the hands of persons unknown. And sometimes the victim would be unknown. They would name them. And so again, like I said earlier, they would die twice. But through the work of Black witnesses, these last few years, we've really seen compelling video that's shown us that these folks are doing this because they believe that it brings a certain level of immortality, not just to the person, but to the cause. And so I dedicate this presentation, as we get ready to open up our discussion, to what I call the Littlest Witness. Her name is Dayana Reynolds, and I dedicated the book to Dayana because she was 4 years old in the back of that car seat when her beloved stepdad, Philando Castile, was shot in front of her. And I thought about, she should have been playing with my daughter. She should not have had to see that. My daughter was 4 years old at the same time. And as I watched Dayana comfort her mom in the back of that squad car, when she was handcuffed, her mom was handcuffed, and she's saying, "Mommy, calm down. I don't want you to get shot too." I just thought about the maturity that some young witnesses have to exhibit so young, so little. And these littlest witnesses are really counting on us to make sure that we don't have a fourth overlapping era of domestic terror. And so that's what that's how I approach my work. And that's the frame that I always use. And it's really for Dayana and all the little kids who've lost their parents to police brutality that I do this work.
Thank you, Professor Richardson. That was just lovely. And I hope for folks that have not yet partaken of the book, that this was a sufficient enticement to partake of it. I like, and I'll shut up, academics, as you know, can talk endlessly. But before we turn things over to the group, I just wanted to say a few things in praise of the book, and also to connect us our work together a little bit more explicitly. When I first ran into Ernest Becker, before all of you all were born in the last millennium, it gave me a new way of looking. And I like how you portray Black witnessing in that regard. I was just literally blown away when Becker just said that our vast intelligence makes us aware of our existence. And while that's incredibly uplifting, it's also terrifying because it makes us realize the inevitability of death. And because of that, we yearn for a sense of heroic transcendence that we obtain by embracing a cultural worldview that gives us a sense that life has meaning and we have value, which would be great, except for the unintended consequences that Becker and terror management theory, go on to point out. And very simply, it's that, it's two things. One is that people who are different are intrinsically threatening. The other thing is that there's still a little bit of death anxiety beneath the surface of consciousness, regardless of the power of our worldviews. And that inclines us to select other individuals and to declare them the all-encompassing repositories of evil. Either way, when existential anxieties are aroused, what our work shows is that repeatedly people denigrate and dehumanize and even destroy folks who are different. And back to Black witnessing, I like when you talk about it. You know, it's a new way of seeing, but then very lovely is when you go on and you elaborate. You say Black witnessing is about seeing, good enough, but it's about being seen. It's about being valued and believed. And here's an intersection between everything I would submit, because here's Black witnessing as just an unbelievably right-minded expression of the universal human longing for meaning, significance, dignity, and respect. And what you offer in terms of Black witnessing, in my mind, is way beyond, just seeing, starting with let's see what's actually happening. The Black witnesses are not willing to take a secondhand, generally historically distorted depiction of the way things are. They're going to start by saying, this is what actually happened. But not enough just to post it on Facebook. The idea is to disseminate the ideas in the service of illuminating so that all of us can see things better, and to hopefully instigate action. And back to Becker for a minute, who insisted that knowledge for its own sake is unconscionable, that we need to parlay our beliefs into action. And that brings us to where you ended up, which is just the wonderful insistence that we look at the history of Black Americans in its entirety. And that I found it brilliant when you compared it to Jewish people who have memorialized their experiences through the Holocaust, and the necessity of preserving that history, in part because of the symbolic immortality that it confers, but also in large measure to demonstrate that there are things historically that we believe to be long gone that are nevertheless very much with us today. And I think that'll be a good point for me to stop gibbering after one more thought, and that's to just re-emphasize what you said, is that for people of color, the Holocaust has not yet ended. And in many ways, anyone who's not been in a coma, who's an American, I think I hope can agree that it's about time that we go back to minute one and reassess things in light of history and in light of these ideas. Because from a terror management theory or Ernest Becker perspective, for white people, the denigration of people of color is an implicit and explicit part of the American worldview. Whether we like to admit it or not, we're a country founded on genocide, built on the backs of slaves. And racism, as you know better than I, is a cultural, race rather, is a cultural construction to justify racism. And for white people who experience existential anxieties, their reaction to it is to become even more explicitly and implicitly racist. And we know that, and that's unfortunate. And I think we've been doing a lot of work from that end of things. More work, though, and your book reminded me that there's more to be done from our perspective here, is to think about how these same psychological and economic and political forces have adversely impacted people of color. And as you know, we share a love of Du Bois's Souls of Black Folks and the idea of double consciousness. And my introduction to these ideas is from that wonderful work. And so we know that there's structural inequalities that have persisted for centuries. And we know that there's also the very real physical danger that people of color face every day. But then there's that double consciousness idea that Du Bois presented over a century ago, that people of color are always, whether they're aware of it or not, viewing themselves from two perspectives: how I see myself and how I see other people seeing me. And of course, we all do that, except when you live in a culture that denigrates being a person of color and you happen to be a person of color. Every waking moment, whether you're aware of it or not, you're under what Claude Steele in this century would call stereotype threat. And there's a massive literature suggesting that the toll that this takes on people of color is frankly inestimable. And so I think that on the one hand, things have gotten pretty bad between a pandemic and seething racial and political tensions. But if there's ever something good that can come from near catastrophe, I hope it will be a mutual recognition on the part of all Americans that we do need to address these concerns, and to do so in a spirit of humanity and camaraderie, I hope, because at our best, I think that we could make progress if we can just remember our commonalities despite our differences. Maybe a naive way to conclude my meandering ramblings, but let me stop there and just thank you again for being here with us. And let's see if the folks that are out there in the ethereal mist have anything they'd like us to address. Ooh, all right, wait a minute. I don't have an 8-year-old child to help me. All right, so here's a question. How has terror management theory, or I'll say Ernest Becker, informed your understanding between Black witnessing and white consumption of this journalistic work? Are these images still making a difference, or are we becoming desensitized? And I know you write about that in the book.
Yeah, I like that question a lot. I mulled that over a lot towards the end of the book, because I began to see people who were not Black getting desensitized to it. I think a turning point for me was when I was in the office one day and I saw someone watching one of these police shootings, and they were just eating a bowl of cereal, and they were just kind of like, munching and watching. And I thought, wow, this is not having the same effect. Well, my people, we don't want to look anymore. We're just saying, I feel traumatized. I feel like these folks could be me. They look like me, or they look like someone I'm related to. I don't know if I can watch these anymore. And so last year, I kind of went on this one-woman tour. I kind of converted the book tour into a finger-wagging tour at my colleagues in the press. And I said, you all, we have to be more careful about how we're sharing these videos, not putting any kind of warning over them, not blurring out faces, and oversaturating his images are actually doing the opposite of what you think they are. They're reinforcing a racial hierarchy. And they said, how so? And I said, when is the last time that you've seen a white person die on primetime television? And they were like, oh. And I said, and they said, well, how will we be able to prove that this happened if we don't have video? I said, we know 9/11 happened. And we know that there were people who were forced out of those buildings because it was just too hot inside. And that video used to exist, and it used to horrify me. And I was glad when it was scrubbed from the internet, that I didn't have to see people falling out of those buildings anymore. And as a young journalist, I was terrorized by the images of Daniel Pearl being beheaded on camera. That was scrubbed from the internet. All the mass shootings that largely affect white people that used to live on the internet and that made their way onto the news eventually were scrubbed. We found a way to do that. Why is it that we're perpetuating Black death in this way? Why is it that I can look on any kind of news wire, and if I type in Trayvon Martin to get a stock photograph, I'll get his post-mortem photograph and not the one of him smiling and living, or the one with his dad kissing him on the cheek that's become so popular? Why? And they were saying, oh, you're right. And they said, we need to do something differently. And so I wrote a piece in the Atlantic about it. I went on MSNBC and talked about it a couple of times, and basically said that when we're doing this, we're telling Black people, prove to me, pre-litigate your case. Prove to me you didn't deserve this. I need to see some footage, or else I don't believe that you didn't deserve what the police meted out. And we don't ask anyone else to do that. And I said, but if we're not careful, it will start spreading to other races. And I mentioned, look at what happened with this instance of the migrant who washed up on shore with his child. That ran in newspapers, those two bodies on the shore. And I said, if we're not careful, we're going to keep desensitizing people to the issues of Black and brown folks because we don't consider their lives or their final moments, their deaths, important. And so I've been really, stressing to newsrooms that they need to be more mindful about how they use them. And I'll also say, in speaking with a lot of my white colleagues, they said, I am affected by these, but differently, because I don't see myself reflected as the victim, nor do I see myself reflected as the aggressor. I would never put my knee on someone's neck. And I would never, I would imagine, be under someone's knee. So I can have kind of almost a casual distance or remove from it and still care about it, but not be as viscerally moved as you. And they said that's what I think is missing from a lot of not just newsrooms, but ordinary people when they go to put them on their social media feeds. And so in the essay that I wrote, I also said, if you were to think of these videos and equate them to lynching photographs and give them that solemn respect, it would make you think twice about posting it. Many of us would not just go post a lynching photograph on our social media feed, but by elevating them to that level, I think we'd be more mindful of it. And so that piece had almost 100,000 views within its first day and was translated into 3 different languages. And I spoke on every continent except for Antarctica about that piece last summer, telling people that if we were to equate them, then we would be more mindful. So to answer your question, yes, TMT definitely is infused in everything I do, because Black people, when we see these, realize that this could be us very easily. And that's why we record them, but we record them and then really give them off to people to seek justice, not for entertainment. These aren't snuff films. We would like, the proper authorities to see these and make sure that someone has to, face the music for it. And so that's, I think, the thing that really got me, is that a lot of people, by trying to immortalize their loved one in doing this, is really towing the line between awareness and desensitization.
Wow, that's very thoughtful. And while you were responding, it reminded me of something that Erich Fromm wrote about in the 1940s, his book Escape from Freedom. Mm-hmm. That Fromm said that one of the things that he found alarming that's uniquely American is the juxtaposition in news between supposed news and the other elements of commercial broadcasting. And this is to my discredit, but I can't remember the name of the gentleman who fell asleep online at a fast food restaurant and was shot. Was that in Atlanta?
It was shot, yes.
Yes, and this, again, I believe, and this is me being in my Magoo phase, I do believe it's important to name yes. folks. But I still have bad dreams of sorts watching a video of that in a well-intentioned newscasts that would then cut to commercial for like a Taco Bell commercial. Yeah. And I found it like a horror film, because mm-hmm. If you were only paying a little bit of attention, it's like, yeah, oh, that dude got shot, that's bad. And then I'll take the number 2 and give me a drink the size of my leg. It just seemed surreal how we went from an event to a commercial.
But you know what, Sheldon? And I love that. I love that you said horror, because I think TMT really seeps into Black people's spirits as we create things now too. If you notice, these last few award seasons, they've been dominated by African American works that dabbled in the horror genre. If you think about Get Out, if you think about Lovecraft Country, think about The Watchmen, which is also sci-fi-ish. They've all dabbled in the horror that exists for many Black people of going about their day, about the seemingly banal act of going into a fast food restaurant and maybe not making it out of the parking lot, going into a Starbucks just to have a meeting and maybe not making it out there, falling asleep in a dorm room, in a dorm hall rather, and at Yale, and having the police called on you, maybe not making it out there. There's always that consciousness that whatever you do, just living while Black, could end up dead in a deadly outcome. And that kind of horror, I think, has been reflected in the art now, is what we're seeing. We're seeing so many people, even in the movie Us, is focusing on what happens when Black people really peel back the layers of what it's like and be honest about how we are perceiving the world. And I think that this show, Lovecraft Country from HBO, really made me think a lot about, because it dabbled in magic also. And the, spoiler alert, at the very end, the magic or the mystical power was transferred to Black people to do as they please, to make all these scientific advancements and things like that. And it had to be wrested from white power, though. And I thought about that and I thought, wow, you do lose a lot of time and a lot of creativity, and you lose a lot by being worried all the time about your mortality. Despite that, though, African Americans have still made incredible strides creatively, scientifically, but it's not been without cost. You look at the infant mortality rate and the maternal mortality rate amongst Black women, we're dying, scores more than our white counterparts just by giving birth. So the very act of us giving birth makes us more likely to die because people aren't listening to us or believing us when we say something's wrong. When we look at this dual pandemic, we look at COVID, and we think about the horror there of African Americans not being treated equally in the hospitals. And we think about them being placed into these proverbial pits, as Black nurses have called them, where they don't receive care all day. No one comes on rotation to see them. That's a horror film, right? Sounds like horror, and it is. And so I think when I think about TMT and how it infuses my work, I also think about how it almost works in the inverse for Black people. When I read about Becker's work and I read about his notions of how the notion that one will die makes people join white supremacist groups, I thought, wow, it's almost working the opposite for Black people, because we're like, well, I know that there's a chance that I could die tomorrow. And so I'm going to make sure that I live as joyfully as I can until then. And a lot of people, I think in early stages, looked at this as a kind of nihilism, especially as hip hop became mainstream. People were kind of like, why are they just partying and drinking and stuff like that? What is this? And I think it was misunderstood. I think a lot of the joy that you see from Black people stems from, we don't have long here. And so we've got to really enjoy the life that we have, because we don't know how long it's going to be. It's not promised. And when you see big cultural movements occurring during times of great existential dread, it's Black people leading us out of those moments. If you think about the start of the pandemic, for example, when COVID-19 set in and that dread set in that we're going to be in this for a while, it was Black people who were making up TikTok dances to get you through, right? And you saw Black folks making up all these things and people were like, that looks pretty fun. It was a Black DJ who created this days long set where he was just spinning music. And First Lady Michelle Obama came into the room, and Oprah Winfrey came into the room, and everybody is like having this big party with DJ Nice. And I think that with D Nice, and I think that the thing that I really took away from that is, even though the world is in mourning right now, it's still Black people that are still trying to say, let's keep our spirits up. And where does that come from? And I kept trying to study that. Where does that come from? Because of all people, we should be really depressed right now. We should be really sad. And when this summer happened, we were really depressed and really sad. But again, there was almost this push against that to say, no, Black joy is resistance too. And so, yes, to go back and forth with that juxtaposition you're talking about, that's what Black witnessing really fights against. It fights against that, I'll have the number 2, or next item, please, I don't want to talk about this. And it makes those stories matter. And I know it's almost hackneyed now to say that Black lives matter, but that's really the heart of it. Is we wanted to communicate, you can't just kill Black people and it doesn't matter. And when we see that not being the case all of the time, especially, the case with Breonna Taylor just hurt me so much, because I thought that could be me. I could have been at home just asleep, not somebody busts in the door and then I'm just shot, and no one gets in trouble for that at all. And there's not even a formal apology. I'm like, what? To me, when I've read that, I just thought, this is real. This is something that I really have to communicate to both of my children. And again, made me want to go to the beach that weekend, live fully with my kids, and say, I just don't know. I really hope that I have a long life with them. I just don't know. And I think that that's a lot of what Black people feel when they are engaging in Black witnessing, is trying to capture and document as much of their story as possible, because it's very possible that someone can just overlook it, rewrite it, or not even care about it. And I think that it's going to be very interesting. I tie so much of this Black witnessing to Jewish witnessing, because I think that it's been memorialized, as you said, and packaged in such a way that we understand it viscerally and immediately, that this thing happened to millions of people. The Holocaust actually happened, and there are survivors who still live among us. You can't say the same about slavery. The last slaves passed away in the 30s and 40s. There's a big push by FDR to capture their voices through the Federal Workers Project, and Zora Neale Hurston and all these folks were very active in capturing those voices. And the Library of Congress has that big repository, but we don't have that living connection anymore. So it's very easy for people to say, oh, that was such a long time ago, you should be over that. And I worry about that with the Jewish American community. Will we get to that point where people are like, that's so long ago? Because I already see Gen Xers, my students, saying, oh, that wasn't such a big deal. The Holocaust wasn't such a big deal. And they make jokes about it. I have had students who are upset about TikTok videos that are anti-Semitic. And I, consider, a lot of that dual struggle between Jewish Americans and African Americans to be just a fight to tell the story and a fight to be believed and seen. And when you have your witnesses die, it takes something out of that. And so I think a lot of my work is trying to capture as many voices as I can, just as, the Shoah Foundation here at USC does, to save those last testimonies. Because again, it sounds morbid, but you're tying it to the fact that, people are dying off, and you have to capture those stories before they go. Oh, you're on mute, Sheldon. Sorry.
There we go. That's great. All right, how about now? I wish we had a couple hours, but very important points. I do think that people of color and Jewish people have a lot of common history and a lot of common interests. If we had more time, I would also point out that the same white supremacists, supporters of Orange Hitler, former President Trump, they're equally anti-Semitic. And anyone who thinks we're in a post-racial or post-anti-Semitic world, I would humbly submit has been in a coma or ought to read the news. And so I think that's an important point. Also, anybody in America who's a decent human, with all respect to the folks I'm about to annoy, should be indebted to Black people. It is Black people and Black women who are responsible for our current president, who I find to be exponentially superior to the last one. And as Du Bois points out in one of our mutually favorite pieces, Black folks have been contributing since minute one and have never asked for more than the opportunity to participate as colleagues at the table of culture. And I love when Du Bois says at the end of the piece, what harm would there be if all of the great contributions, the good-hearted and cheerful demeanor of people of color, is precisely the antidote for Du Bois. It's my favorite phrase: blustering, dyspeptic, brutal dyspeptic blundering. That sums white people up as a caricature of a stereotype pretty well. All right, next question. Do either of us feel that existential awareness of our mortality during the pandemic may have influenced involvement in the protests and activism after George Floyd's murder?
I definitely think so. I think that I will back it up just before that, before that moment. I saw white protesters who were armed at state houses saying, we want to get out of our houses. We want haircuts. We want to be out. This is enough. And I thought, what if that were Black protesters? Oh my gosh, they're armed and they're just, out there. And they were facing off with police officers, nose to nose with them, and nothing was happening. Well, we got our answer a few weeks later. And I think that juxtaposition of seeing white folks out there with guns, with those weapons, saying that they were being enslaved. I even saw one woman with like chains around her saying that she was being enslaved in her home. People were just like, no, sis, that's not what's going on here. And then when we saw the eruption in the streets in Minneapolis that began peacefully, again, looking like Ferguson Redux in terms of a peaceful protest met with militarism, and then outside actors, but this time cameras showing that there were white agitators breaking windows at an auto zone, setting things on fire. We were like, whoa, we have to get away from this narrative now about Black people tearing up their own community, because now we've got video proof from these mojos of it not being them. So what do we do? And I had a lot of newscaster friends who were like, do we air that? Do we show the AutoZone guy? Now we know he's a white supremacist and we know what groups he's affiliated with. Like, what do we do? And I was like, you report it. But there was no frame for it, right? Because we're used to seeing Watts, we're used to seeing LA, we're used to seeing African Americans, we assumed, tearing up their own neighborhoods. And so I think that was at play, the fact that people were able to see with their own eyes that there were other agitators in here who were trying to make this a violent incident, and it didn't need to be one. That was the first part. I think two, people from all walks of life got a little glimpse of what it is like to be Black. When you're in the pandemic and when you're told you can only stay in this area, hello, that's what redlining was for us for so many years. That's what curfews were about. That's what lantern laws were about during slavery, that says you had to be in when those, lanterns came out. Black people need to be inside. And so there's always been a certain restrictive element to Blackness. That's why the Green Book was a thing, to tell us where we could go, where we could travel, where was safe for us. We have sundown towns. You need to be out of this town by sundown or you could be lynched. And so that's what being Black was about for a very long time. And it still exists in new forms in terms of making sure that we stay in our place and in certain corners. And so when other people had to experience that, saying stay at home, or your job is going to be taken from you, or you're going to have to go on these, public services and stand online and figure it out. A lot of folks were like, oh, this is what it is like to have things just taken away quite quickly and for no good reason. And for a lot of people, it didn't make sense because they never experienced that level of captivity, if you will. And that's not every Black person's experience. But it is a majority of African Americans' experience to be kind of locked into a certain part of town and not allowed to leave. And so I think that when people realize that feeling cornered, feeling shut in was going to be a reality for quite a time, and getting back to business as usual looked like police brutality, everybody was like, I don't want to get back to that. I want the world to be better when we leave this thing. I'm hoping that this changes us for the better. And that's what I kept hearing over and over again, is I thought that this would change things. And so when people began to see the Black Lives Matter, the COVID edition play out with, the Miami doctor, for example, who was pulled over by police and told to open his van. And he's like, I was, tending to homeless people. Well, prove it. Show me your ID and all of that stuff. People just got exasperated. And I think a lot of folks were saying, I want this country to be better. Two, I now know that the government maybe has a hard time doesn't care about any of us under the last administration. A lot of people felt like, hey, this thing is not getting dealt with. No one is figuring this out for us. There's no payments. There's the hospital systems. There's no PPE. And there was almost a universal dread that, wow, we first thought the nation didn't care about Black folks. Now it's looking like they don't care about anybody. What's going on? And so I think that banding together that you saw was people who were desperate to get answers, not only from their government, but from each other about what kind of country do we want to be coming out of this. And they really braved COVID-19. The pandemic was still raging when they were protesting, but they put on their masks and they went out there. And I think the fact that we saw people from all walks of life just speaks to how fragile people felt at the time, because they knew that COVID could come for them too. And it was just as likely to kill them as it was someone else. But if it wasn't a knee, then it was going to be COVID. And those are your two choices. It just wasn't acceptable for a lot of people.
Very good. One more question.
Okay.
Knowing what you do about Ernest Becker and terror management theory, what's a good framework in which to support African American lives? Any thoughts on what people can do to keep pushing progress and support for African American health and safety?
Absolutely. I would say follow the Stacey Abrams, LaTosha Brown model, and to vote, to get people from all walks of life to vote. We saw this last time, the power of multi-ethnic coalition politics at play. And even though African-American women were the heartbeat of that, and we're out there doing voter registration, making sure that people had the right to vote, turning states blue that had never been blue before, but it really touched me to see people from all walks of life realize that they mattered, and to see the indigenous community on horseback riding horses to their polls brought me to tears. I was like, wow, these are groups that are part of the electorate that deserve voices, that deserve to matter and to be heard. And I think that really shook the establishment. Folks are scared about that. There are laws trying to be passed right now to make sure that never happens again. And I'm really closely watching to see, what's going on in Georgia, because that could be replicated in other places in terms of blocking the right to vote. But, I believe John Lewis passed on last year because he knew the younger generation had it. He's like, I'm going to pass you this baton. And it's really up to us to make sure that all his work wasn't in vain. And to support, Black and Brown lives means to make sure that they have a voice in the halls that matter most. And that's in your legislative halls. And I see a lot of people from the Black Lives Matter movement running for office and winning, like Cori Bush, which is amazing. And I also see a lot of folks who are just like, for the first time, I'm just going to vote, because I've seen now how deadly it can be to have a president who does not care about my life. And so in the interest of all of us, I think that making sure that we can protect our right to vote, making sure that we can protect mail-in voting for those of us who are old or sick is going to be essential.
Wow, thank you. That was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you both. Do you have any final comments, Sheldon? Are you good? Okay. Well, I know I feel like we could go on for hours, and this was just so interesting. Sorry that we didn't get to everyone's questions, but I think a lot of the questions actually kind of got answered, even if they weren't explicitly asked. So first off, a huge thank you to both Dr. Richardson and Sheldon for your time and your insights today and allowing us to learn from you. What an honor to have a woman like Dr. Richardson with us during Women's History Month. So that was a nice treat. And also thank you to everyone who attended and for your interesting questions. A recording of the webinar will be sent via email to all who registered, and then it'll be made publicly available within 30 days. If you enjoyed this webinar, please support the EVF by signing up for our news and event notices, telling your friends, or making a donation at our website to support future events and guests such as this today. Would either of you like to add anything before we close?
Yes, I'd just like to add one thing. I'd just like to ask everybody to keep in their minds and hearts the 8 Asian Americans who lost their lives last night due to a white supremacist killing them. And I'd like to keep their families and their friends in our hearts and minds as we go forward with our week.
Thank you so much for that. Yes. Well, hopefully if please share this webinar. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, you can always reach out to the Ernest Becker Foundation and we can follow up and put you in touch. And other than that, thank you so much and see you guys next time. Okay, I just